and welcome back to another episode of This American Negro. This American Negro is a podcast that aims to bridge academia and the hood, and so I do believe that information should be accessible to everybody, and this is my way of being a communicator of that information. And so, before we get into it, if you are new here, my name is Marquise Davon. Keith, This American Negro. Please never call me Mark. Thank you and welcome to my channel. Welcome to my podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, awesome. I appreciate you. If you're just simply listening to this on your commute, I hope you enjoy the conversation as well and you have something else to think about, right? You can also support me if you're interested in this podcast and the work that I do by supporting me on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. So that is patreon.com/Marquise Davon. That's MarquiseDavon. You'll find that in all the description boxes below. Again, YouTube or the podcast space as well. And again, this is going to help me out, support this show, be able to produce more content, be able to get a team to help me produce this content a lot faster and more efficiently, because I do want to make sure that I'm staying consistent in this season. And other than that, there are non-monetary ways to donate to me as well and support me. And so that is sharing this podcast when you're listening to it. When you see me share clips on Instagram, those are other opportunities to be able to share it out, because you never know who is going to see the content, engage with me, whether that's on Twitter, whether that's on Instagram, TikTok. These are all spaces that you can engage and move the conversation along and keep pushing it. The last piece is also making sure that you're subscribing to this content and also subscribing to any of my channels. This helps me pop up on playlists a lot more. This helps me pop up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify at a much faster rate. All of this is super important to my own growth, but also making sure that the podcast grows in itself too, because those numbers do matter to the people who are asking me, what is my worth, X, Y, and Z. So I appreciate you. I got to get all that administrative stuff out the way. But I'm super excited for this episode. This one is a little bit more near and dear to my heart. And I'm going to be talking around my experience as a Black male educator, but also the activist fatigue that I do believe is a part that plays a role in why we are burning out at such a high rate and our numbers are steadily decreasing in our representation in the field. Specifically, this episode is going to focus on Black men. I know Black women and Black non-binary folks and femmes also have a particular lived experience, but those are not mine. So I'd rather just focus in on what I can really talk to a lot more, but also have a little bit of dialogue to go back and forth with it. So just want to kind of level set for this episode. I'm super excited to hop into this conversation. But before we get into that, welcome to Storytime with the Negro. I'll tell you my personal connection, and then I'll start telling you a little bit more about my ideas and then things that we could potentially do to help mitigate this burnout and this activist fatigue that I believe Black male educators are facing in particular. So I never wanted to get an education. I did not like it. I said, I ain't never working with no kids. They get on my nerves, this, that, and the third. And I ended up leaving college and I got a job as a full-time social media content consultant, realized I did not like it. And then I had realized that the space that I thoroughly enjoyed was being in front of people and bringing people to a space of catharsis and learning. And so that was a little bit more purpose-driven for me. It wasn't necessarily task-driven, which is what I was doing in the tech space, but this one had a purpose to it. And so I had this realization. I was just like, oh, I was a dramaturg in college, and that's the person who has to inform the actors, the audience, the director, the production team, everything around the details of the play. Why are we creating it? What does the setting mean? What do the costumes mean? What do specific words mean? What was going on socially, politically, and economically at that time? All of that stuff mattered. And so afterwards, I would be the one who led the debriefs after people would sit there and watch the plays, whether on the main stage or the second stage. And if they had questions, I could answer it or direct it to the right person. But we can go back and leave with a little bit more understanding of what the intent of the play was. And so I had realized, I was like, yo, I actually thoroughly enjoy this piece, but I just didn't know how these skills would transfer to other things. So I was just like, great, I guess this can only live in the world of the theater. But the skills I was learning was audience engagement and management, bringing clarity, utilizing real life world examples, um, and being able to like communicate and teach. I was doing that a lot of the time with my peers, but also with a bunch of strangers. And so I was like, oh, I didn't realize it at the time, but when I accidentally got into education, I started working with a STEM and social justice program, and I realized I got in front of people and I could command a room. I said, oh, wait, I'm naturally charismatic. This space is important. It's understanding. I know how to like navigate, work a room, build relationships with students, and also my peers, and be able to help guide them as well. And that for me was super important because I wanted to ensure that like I'm not getting up here and I'm not freezing in front of these kids. I'm not like nervous in front of these kids because that's bugged out to me. I don't think that's a compelling educator, whatever you're trying to teach or convince these people of, right? Um, and so I really just leaned into like my natural charisma, and then I learned around like different skills to use, whether it's walking around the room and making sure everybody's staying on task, and that is um, audience management. That is your classroom management stuff, right? So it just transferred right over. Another piece of it is also making sure that people understand what the point of this thing is. Why am I learning this today? What is this going to ultimately help me be able to do? How can I use this in real life? What is the application of what you're teaching me right now? And that was important. Those are your objectives. These are your learning goals. This is what we need to do to get to the end. So I'm like learning as I'm on this job around like how I show up in these spaces, but also like these are actual teacher techniques, right? And so I am learning the base of being an educator, but I'm also understanding that I love working with the youth. I really enjoy that space because there's so much possibility, imagination, and opportunity for these kids when given the right resources. And I think that piece is important. We're going to come back to that resource piece a little bit later in the conversation. But I realized like once these Black kids had the opportunity to imagine the world that they wanted to live in, they were able to come to class with all of their resources and needs met. Then we were able to see a different level of student be able to be there. Now, again, they're still kids, so, you know, sometimes it's a headache here, sometimes it's an attitude there. There is some kids that just did not bang on my energy, right? And so those are also the realities of being in the education space. But it was the first time that I felt like I was directly doing work that felt impactful, right? And that was always important to me. And so I ended up in the after school space. Again, it gave me a little bit more freedom to teach how I wanted to teach, to build informal relationships, but also take care of kids in a space that I just think is neglected. And that's a whole rant in another episode in terms of like the importance of after school programs and well done after school programs that serve, I won't get into that just yet, but after school programs were important. So I loved doing that because they had a significant impact on my life. And so this was another way for me to be able to work with youth. And then it just turned into like, yo, Marquise, you're actually having really good conversation and you're having a really good impact on these kids. And I began to wonder, what would I look like in a classroom? So I became a paraprofessional and I was able to learn on the job. I was also able to read a lot. I was able to take skills that I already naturally had, and they were just natural inclinations of a teacher. But from there, I was able to understand how to teach well, how to guide a conversation, how to have a successful class from beginning to end. And I started out with 7th graders, then I went to 5th grade for a year, and then 9th and 10th grade, and then I just stayed in 9th grade after that. And so when I think around my journey through this, it was super important because I understood I had to engage in self-care, and that was super huge for me at the time, was like, what is my mental well-being doing? And I also ended up falling into teaching, formal classroom teaching during the pandemic is when I switched out, right, from after school to like classrooms. And so even then I had to teach in a particular kind of way. And there were some things I just questioned. I said, this feels very robotic. Why are we doing this? And it just was like, repeat this phrase, do this thing over again. Make sure that you're giving deposits. Make sure that you're doing this. And you can hear it's like teach like a champion. Again, I took the good from it, ignored the rest. But it taught me to be data driven. It taught me to curate a lesson. It taught me to understand how to do lesson planning efficiently and effectively. And these gave me the skills and the foundation that I needed that I can turn into the teacher that I wanted to be. So I had to spend a year doing developmental work. I had to spend a year learning from another teacher, learning from multiple teaching styles and seeing like how every single person did this. But I got into education and I had a cohort of people. I got to learn from 4 different mentor teachers. I got to sit there and go to conferences. I got to understand all parts of the education system and understood the role that I played, right? And as a para, you know, you have a small cohort of kids that you're going to like work with potentially, but to also be able to teach and gain the skills and go through rigorous practice and learning like, all right, let's do this again, let's do this again, let's do this again. Learning online to transferring that in person to see how your body works. It all reminded me of theater. I said, oh, this is like a script. Let me memorize this script. Let me make sure those moments when the audience needs to sit there and enjoy their laughs for a little bit, when I can feel my partner's energy, whether they are my co-teacher or a student who's assisting me in a lesson, when to give them the energy, when to return the energy, bounce off, improv on top. And so I consistently looked at this as theater, as a performance, but it was one that took time and one that was more crucial. I was anxious around teaching kids because I said, what if I ruin them? What if I'm that teacher that messes everything up for them? And so I remember that being important because I came into this job and I had mentors. I had instructional development, specifically instructional development, because that is the piece that was important for me and the thing that I think is actually most important to any person getting into education. You need a strong foundation because kids deserve a good teacher. Now, I say all of that because I also needed a job that felt fulfilling and purpose-driven for me. So I needed to learn the art and the science before I can actually engage in how do I help the system? How do I become effective? How do I push and agitate and change and ask these questions that people may not want to have to answer because we're already doing this human services work? Why do I have to even do anything else? Like, know your role and keep it going. But for me, the activist in me is always thinking around systems and change and efficiency and how do we make this thing better for an area that was never designed for us to thrive in. And so I spent the last 4 years in education. And then I just found myself in the recent time, like feeling like I was not doing enough. And I kept feeling like, yo, is this actually changing people's lives? Are we actually doing the work that we need to do? Am I doing my part in what I need to do? Am I showing up in the best way? Am I supporting these families in the best way? How are these systems impacting them here and there? And I had realized I had started to become invested in more of the system and thinking around my every single day, like, am I making a change? Am I making a change? But in the back of my head, I'm also just like, teaching is also a thankless job. Like, you're never going to know the fruits of your labor until years later when a student comes back and they're just like, yo, this is what you did for me. This is where I'm at now because of you, right? It's something that you're going to see years later, and you don't even realize, like, you are interacting with thousands of kids depending on how long you're in this education space, how often you are cycling through new kids coming in and out and in and out, right? And so that's the first piece. I wanted to share, like, my personal experience with starting to feel myself get burnt out. And I was just tired. I came home irritated. I just was like, I'm dejected. It took away my energy. I started getting snippy. And I was just like, I am not doing enough. And so I just remember I stopped creating content for 8 months. I stopped. I wasn't reaching out to people the way that I normally did. My relationships and friendships were not sustaining. They kept it like right there at surface level, but I wasn't being genuine around like, yo, I'm actually struggling. Because emotionally, I feel like these kids are still experiencing the worst of the world. And even in the school, it felt like nothing was changing. And it felt like we were just replicating systems. And I was just like, I can't unsee this. And I want to do something that is going to change. But I'm somebody who believes in not trying to mess up a system right away. Because, and again, I still say burn it down. But I mean more so like I need to learn the layout. Like I didn't get involved in Philly politics until my 3rd year of living here. I didn't get involved in trying to do like this most amount of change until I at least had 2 or 3 years of skin in the game. And even then, that still puts me as an early career educator, but I'm an activist at heart. I'm an organizer at heart. I see issues and I'm just like, how do we fix this? And I know that'd be annoying for my bosses because they're always just like, Marquise, just focus on this. Let us handle this. Trust us to do this. And I'm just like, but it requires all the parts. And so a lot of me was just like, I was sold education as like, this is the biggest social justice act you can do, the biggest level of sacrifice you can do. And for me, I was just like, I don't like that. And I realized I had watched a video of mine early on, and I was just like, yeah, I don't want to be the black male educator who is going to save all of these kids because they need a black man in the room. Because we understand if black kids have one black male educator in the room, then there's 13% more likely they'll go to college. If they get two of them before like third or fourth grade, there's a 32% likely chance that they'll go to college, right? It increases. So there's just a very raw benefit of us simply existing in this space. Now, for me, it's also recognizing the fact that black male educators are dwindling. We were at 1.9, almost 2%, and now we're sitting at 1.7, and I see that number just continuously going down. I'm also part of that group that is leaving the education space, right? And that was a very hard decision for me because I was just like, I feel valued in the classroom. I know I'm a good teacher. I know these boys need me. Everybody told me these boys need you. But something about that level of pressure and also feeling like I was losing my spark for teaching, I was losing my passion for it. I was coming to work and I felt like these kids were not getting the best of me in my last year of teaching. I was like, this is not fair to them. And I'm somebody who I was like, I need to be immaculate at my job and my professional duties before I can do anything else, before I can break the rules and agitate and be annoying, because at least you can't tell me that I can't do my job, right? And so I think it's interesting because I'm experiencing these thought processes and I'm thinking about, where is this coming from? How did this start? How come there's only 1.7% of black men in this space? All of the things are happening. And so for me, I was just like, all right, let me just take a step back real quick. So we understand that this is an issue. We understand the benefits, but where did it all start? Right? Where did it start? Because black people are creative, we're intellectuals, we're activists, we're thinkers, we're organizers, we're community caretakers. And Sharif Al-Mekki had talked around it and talked around the unintended consequences of Brown versus Board of Education. And I had never like connected those things together because for me, I'm just like, no, everybody reveres it. But as I'm listening and I'm learning from the more people who are older than me, not let me call them like ancestors or the elderly because that's crazy. But older educators, veteran educators talk around it. Al-Mekki talks around the impact of the Brown versus Board is multi-tiered. He says the interpretation of Brown versus Board was even more damaging. The idea that it promoted that in order for a black child to have excellence, it had to be in proximity of whiteness, which automatically erases the black educator. Brown was about having black children have access to the board, so the resources that supported public education at the level it was supported for white children. And I think that is going to be important as you listen to Dr. Leslie T. Fenwick's words, because she is a professor of education policy at Howard University. But this is also very real. I always say I want access to the resources. I don't need to be integrated with y'all. But if you already think that the profession that is predominantly white women led, and then we're only 1.7%, it also made me think around this system that we integrated these black people into. Y'all weren't going to want us there anyways. It's still another system that's not designed for us. And so you're going to start seeing our academic performances going down. You're going to see race-based stress start to happen. All of these unintended consequences of integration are happening, and we're seeing the worst of it happen on the educational level. The resources that are moving away, white flight, redlining, to get to the good schools, quote unquote, you need to travel far distances to get there. You need to walk far distances to get there, which is already taking away from the child, right? So the silver spoon versus the bootstraps. What's going to happen here? And so it became this re-ingrained idea that like, oh, our educators, black people are not good enough to be in this job that requires nurturing and development of a child and intellectual rigor. All of that plays a role in where we're finding ourselves today. And I'm speaking about a black man because as black men, it's already like a job that goes against what we're supposed to be, quote unquote, supposed to be by societal standards as a man. A teacher, an educator is nurturing. You have to worry about the well-being of children. You have to think about families. You have to think about community. You have to be in this role that is dominant but it's still usually based in femininity because it's still a caretaker role, right? So that's one piece that we have to adjust to. And we now have to also think around, like, how does everybody else in this space view us, right? Because now we have to worry about how do, white women, how do white women view us if we're in their space with them? How do white men view us if we're in space with them? How do black women view us when we're in space with them? How do black children interact with us, right? And the differences of black boys, black femmes, black girls, all of this exists. And now we have to also do the mental gymnastics and also have a self-awareness in ourselves of just like, great, if I were to do this thing, how is this going to potentially impact X, Y, and Z person? We're always hyper aware of this. I was hyper aware of like, all right, if I were to say this or challenge this person, will they then think that I'm incompetent? Oh, Marquise, you might be too young to know any better. Oh, Marquise, well, you're a man. You're trying, don't do this, don't do that. And I'm somebody who's like super mindful, but I can also I still held those anxieties around like, oh, you can interpret my behavior in any way. And so as a black man, as in education, we also recognize like, oh, there might be young girls who may not understand the face of authority and having a responsibility over a person. There may be young boys who don't know how to differentiate us from a mentor to a brother to an actual teacher and an authority figure. We have people in leadership, black or white, who also are looking at us and can imagine like, all right, where can I place this person? Because they would put us in disciplinary roles, but never in instructional leadership components, right? So even as I looked around, I was like, how many black men are actually in like, or are instructional coaches, instructional leaders, and actually leading, and us being able to see like, oh, wow, okay, we're not just here for classroom management stuff. We're not just here to be culture. We are also here to be instructional leaders. And that to me was like the biggest piece of the foundation. That is going to be super important as I think around the history of the Brown versus Board of Education, as I listen to Al Mekki's words, as I listen to Dr. Leslie Fenwick's words, and I'm looking at my own experience. I'm like, yo, we're trying to work in this system and we're burning ourselves out at the same time. And we're all just simply trying to do our best. But in us all being burnt out and all of us being tired, we're all giving each other the worst of each other. We're all not giving each other grace. Now, when I look at it from a black educator's perspective, there is an economic component to it too, right? If I'm only making 40 something, 50 something, and I'm raising a family, or I'm spending money on trips, or kids are going to ask you, like, can you support me in this thing? It is important to set up boundaries, but it's also recognizing, like, we are doing a lot of work on the daily, and in us doing this work on the daily is exhausting. There's an economic component to it. There's not always the access to therapy. There's not always access to, like, an EAP program that people can go to and utilize. You can find groups, but oftentimes there is a social and emotional component that is needed in order for a black man to sustain himself in these spaces where you're hyper aware of you being the minority in this space most times. I've been lucky enough to always have majority black men in that, like, my education spaces. So again, I had a very cool experience in that regard. However, I think this all comes together to really start to understand, like, oh, if I continue to frame educators and black male educators as activists and social justice leaders, we might also have unintended consequences to that too, right? Because as we continue to sell education as activist work, it can have negative and unintended consequences that can result in a faster burnout than we are already experiencing, especially due to the pandemic. Now, when you think around activist burnout, that is a whole nother space, right? And I've experienced activist fatigue. And so as I'm going to read this definition to y'all, and so we can also level set in like why I believe that activist fatigue is also a huge component into what we're experiencing. So activist fatigue is when activists tie our labor, both physical and emotional, to the issues at hand, as well as our identities. So black male educators, our identities are tied with this space, right? And then we're also emotionally invested in here because we understand and we're invested in the implications of injustice to black boys and black children and other marginalized groups. However, unfortunately, when individuals are in a state of activist fatigue, we're no longer able to seek help because our hopes for change are diminished as a result of feeling overwhelmed. If any of this is starting to resonate with you, yeah, we've experienced some of this. We've talked around this. But due to the intense nature that activists endure, we tend to feel stressed and burnout and the syndrome of emotional exhaustion and reduced personal accomplishment. This stress is going to affect us all in different ways. So it may come out as irritability. It may come out as us closing ourselves off. It may come out in us it's trying to escape. Whatever that thing is, it tends to be burnout. And so when you look at this, we have to understand like activist fatigue is going to affect different people. But when we understand the identity, the implications, and we have this hyper awareness, it now requires a different level of need that is going to be present for us as Black men in these spaces. And so for us as Black men, especially if you're an early career educator, I want us to really be focused on like understanding the science and art of education first. That is going to be important and crucial to your success in this space and sustaining yourself in this space. We're not going to be able to change anything if we're bad educators. Like that's not what's going to happen. The other piece is also if there's ERG groups or if there's spaces for Black men to gather together to talk around our experiences in the education space and understand that we're not alone, we'll feel more seen. We feel more connected, right? We have a unique experience as being one of the least represented in this education space as teachers. For administrators, try to put these systems in place too. At your schools, do you have an actual teacher development pipeline that will help? And it doesn't mean just sending them off to like a school. It's like, what does it look like to get that help right here? Can you set them up with a teacher mentor? Can you set them up with a veteran teacher? Can you give them space before you get back and you do professional development? Let them exist in that space together, because some of us just have to hit the ground running, but some of us may need that extra tender love and care just to handle this too. But that also puts the lift on us too, right? I had to go seek people out. I wanted to get better. I did not just expect things to be handed to me. I don't expect that out of leadership, to always be aware of the stuff that I need. And so I'm a big proponent on closed mouths don't get fed. So it is both groups of people need to make sure that you are also showing up in the best way possible. Black leadership, you understand what it means to be Black, but you are no longer in the classroom as much. So your decision making, your thoughts are very different. Include people who are still on the ground in your decisions that you make as a teacher, and grow those relationships so we also have the best, we can think around you, assume the best intent, words, I can use them, I swear. But Black men in this space, we have to make sure we're taking care of our social and emotional health. So working with Black kids, you may get triggered. You may think that your version of discipline is what you may have needed, but it's not what they need. It is different for everybody. Make sure that you manage your own development, seek out those opportunities, make sure to ask the right questions to go to conferences, make sure that you just check your handbook, because you have a lot of more benefits than you may think. But also start seeking out each other. Talk to each other, be vulnerable with each other, talk around your anxieties, what you're nervous around, but also set goals. What are goals that you can have for the year? What are goals you can have month to month? How do you communicate those goals to your leaders? And then also see if they can do some goal planning with you. Because this is not going to be an easy road. It's not going to be an easy task if we also don't understand what our success can look like when we are in such a thankless job. So I hope that this episode helped out. I hope that there was more thought. I hope that there was more grace that can be extended. I hope that you understood my personal journey with it, understand some historical implications. There was some data. But overall, if you're a Black educator, if you're a Black man in education, let me know your thoughts on this episode. I'm really interested to hear more, and go from there. Have some grace with yourself. You deserve it. Everybody deserves grace in this space of human service work. I appreciate y'all. I look forward to seeing y'all next week. Peace.